Okay, welcome, hello, to our seventh virtual seminar on applied economics and policy analysis in Central Asia. I'm your moderator, Bahram Kasimov. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, Tashkent time. Today, we're very privileged to have Professor Richard Pomfret and discussant Zohd Askarov. Briefly about Richard. Richard probably needs no introduction if you're working on Central Asia. He's been a long-time friend of Central Asia, working on Central Asia since early 1990s. Professor Pomfret is a professor of economics at the University of Adelaide since 1992. And he's written quite several large books on Central Asia, which was very influential for my own work early when I was doing my master's and bachelor's thesis. So, and currently, today he will talk about Uzbekistan and the World Trade Organization, which is a very timely and relevant topic for policymakers around Uzbekistan and Central Asia. To follow up with his discussion and comments after the presentation is our senior lecturer at Westminster International University in Tashkent, Dr. Zohd Askarov. Dr. Zohd Askarov received his PhD from Deakin University, and he's been at Westminster for the last 4 years, I believe. And we're very honored to have both of them today. So thank you very much. Richard, over to you, please.
Thank you, Bahram, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you in this series, which so far has been very impressive. My only regret is that I can't be in Tashkent in person, and I wish all my friends who are listening and participating, my friends in Uzbekistan and other parts of Central Asia, I hope everyone's keeping well under these very difficult conditions. It also means that you're all sitting there in the middle of the afternoon. I'm sitting here just after having had dinner and being in Australia, drinking some wine. So I hope this is going to work well. So Bahram asked me to talk about Uzbekistan and the World Trade Organization. So this is going to be a little bit different from the previous presentation of this series, in that it's not really presenting you with research, it's presenting you a bit with my experience of working on WTO issues in Central Asia and in other parts of the world, and hopefully to pass on something about what I've learned about how this works and how it applies to Uzbekistan. But I'm really seeing this as something more like a discussion of a current policy issue, and I'm really happy to take questions as we go along. I'm looking forward to Zoe's comments when I stop talking in about half an hour, and looking for a very active Q&A. What I'm doing is presenting what's in a background paper that presents this presentation in more detail. And what I will try to do in the presentation is to keep the main topics in mind and leave the details for the paper. So the background paper is about the evolution of Uzbekistan's application to join the WTO, which happened more or less at the same time as the WTO was formed. In the sense, the application was in December 1994. The WTO came into existence in January 1995. And it's kind of interesting in the sense that Uzbekistan's application, when completed, will probably be the longest membership negotiations that there have been so far. So one of the questions to ask is, why has it taken so long? What has been the reasons for this? And then moving on to the present, why have the negotiations been revived and hopefully coming to a conclusion relatively soon? And the answer, this is not a mystery story. The answer is, I think, very clearly that Uzbekistan's development strategy under President Karimov became very inward-looking and interventionist, which was not consistent with WTO commitments. And the real question today of whether Uzbekistan will or should join the WTO, it depends on the commitment to economic reform. If the government is serious about replacing its dependence on resources and protecting manufacturing activities by a more diversified, more competitive economy, then there'll be much to benefit from WTO membership, and Uzbekistan will be welcomed. if the economy remains resistant to fundamental reform, then accession will be difficult and not really something to bother much about. If we just look at this status of WTO accession negotiations, we see that most of the Central Asian countries, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, applied to join the WTO in the mid-1990s. With Kyrgyzstan, this happened very quickly, and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, it got delayed. But in the last decade, Kazakhstan and Tajikistan have joined the WTO. Following Russia and importantly China in the beginning of the 2000s. So this actually changes the decision a bit, because the WTO membership is more useful if other countries are members. And we see today, it's a more or less universal pattern that countries are members of the WTO. Turkmenistan, the big exception in Central Asia, has applied recently for observer status, which will be followed by presumably an application. So this is something that's changed over time. The situation today in 2020 is quite different than in 1994. So I want to talk a bit about how the situation has changed and why that is relevant to Uzbekistan's application. So just to explain what's in the paper has a fairly long session about the history of Uzbekistan's negotiations. Then it makes the point that in Geneva, the WTO has changed considerably since it was formed in 1995, 25 years ago. And that's important, not to be stuck in a view of how the WTO was in the past, but to be aware of how it is today. The paper talks a bit about the particular problems of formerly centrally planned economies in the WTO, which I'll skip over in my presentation. And then I want to move on, hopefully, with most of my presentation about, what does the WTO do today and how is that relevant to Uzbekistan's WTO accession? So very briefly, to go over the history of this. Now, the context was that after independence, we had this very chaotic period in 1992-93 with hyperinflation, nation-building economic transition. Uzbekistan actually adopted a fairly liberal transition strategy in about mid-1994. After the national currency was adopted, there was a fairly standard IMF type of macroeconomic policy adopted, and this is when Uzbekistan applied to join the WTO. But what really changed in October 1996 was that the government introduced foreign exchange controls. It seemed to be a fairly impetuous decision, I think, following sort of difficulties with the cotton harvest and cotton sales. But the point is that with exchange controls, the WTO rules just do not work very much, because if you can't get access to foreign exchange to purchase imports, then it doesn't really matter what your rules are about imports. So this was a crucial barrier. And I think what we see is that the talks for WTO accession, they carried on a couple of years, but really, nothing much was happening after about 2000. And it's this inconsistency between the exchange controls and WTO rules. What we see is that it's a substantial foreign exchange premium in the black market. So this is the diagram I've got on the screen now, shows how this is running from the mid-2000s, 2008. It's running at 50% or more difference between the official exchange rate and the black market rate. And despite sort of fairly cosmetic measures to say that there would be a loosening of the exchange controls, it's very clear that there was not free access to foreign exchange. And this really exploded in the final years of President Karimov's rule. So this was the really fundamental difference between what Uzbekistan was doing and what was needed to join the WTO. So what's happening in the WTO? This is the next part of my paper, is to say, the WTO was established in 1995. It was established as a successor to the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The GATT had been pretty successful over almost 50 years in reducing tariffs among the major trading nations. It had a fairly small secretariat. It wasn't a very interventionist institution like the World Bank or the IMF. Decision-making was by consensus, but it was really about having these rounds of negotiations to reduce tariff, to liberalize trade, but in the meantime, agreeing on rules that you couldn't do things that had the same effect as tariffs. There were rules about transparency, non-discrimination, what to do with non-tariff barriers. That customs officials couldn't arbitrarily set the value of an import, which would determine what the percentage tariff rate was. All of these things. By 1994, all of these rules that had developed in the GATT were consolidated, put into the final act of the Uruguay round, and became the charter for the WTO. So when we look at the WTO, it is different to the GATT, and it involves commitment to agreed rules and practices based on transparency and non-discrimination. And that essentially is why there was a problem for Uzbekistan as the economy was after 1996, because it was not transparent how you got access to foreign currency. So when we looked at the GATT, it was very successful. It went from 23 members to 123 members, but the structure was a bit anachronistic. I think there's a big mistake in 2001 was to launch another round of multilateral trade negotiations, because the idea of consensus was going to make it very difficult to achieve anything in the Doha round. And we see that the difference between the GATT, when a few large economies, the United States, European Union, Japan, and Canada, could take the lead and others would acquiesce. By the 21st century, we've also got the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and other countries who were members of the WTO, so consensus would be hard to reach. So the WTO has not been about reducing trade barriers. It's been more about saying, this is the body of trade law, and we have a rule system, and we have a resolution mechanism if there's any disagreement about the rules. And so it's important that a new member should accept the rules and agree to abide by the rules. So that's a very important distinction between the WTO and the GATT. And I think this can't really be emphasized too much. It's not so much about negotiating reduction of tariffs, it's about agreeing to the rules. And what we see in the 21st century, when we look at the world trade scene, is that tariffs are much less important than they were in the past. There are some high tariffs remain in some countries, but for the European Union, Japan, the United States, Canada, Australia, tariffs are on average well below 5%. What really matters is how to deal with things like subsidies, taxation, discriminatory regulations, and other frictions between trading nations. It's about facilitating trade rather than about liberalizing trade. And these issues are much less amenable to multilateral trade negotiations. It's better suited to saying we agree to the trade law and we'll have mechanisms to resolve dispute. So I think it's important to see the difference between GATT and WTO. It's important to see that a country joining the GATT needs to say, hey, this is our tariff schedule. These are our major non-tariff barriers. That's part of the process. We will accept the codes about technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, intellectual property rights, and so on. And these are important for negotiations because you can negotiate some exceptions or what you're going to apply these codes to. It's not really about saying you've got to have a liberal trade regime. It's about saying you have to abide by these rules of transparency is really important, and non-discrimination. When we look at how the WTO can change, it can only be changed by consensus. We've known since 1997 that there was a need to have some new rules on intellectual property rights, investment, trade facilitation, government procurement, but not much has really happened. When we have new issues like digital trade and e-commerce, in 1995, the internet hardly existed. It's hard to believe this is only 25 years ago. So there are no rules in the WTO about digital trade and e-commerce. What we do have are moves to have a plurilateral agreement. Plurilateral agreement says that like-minded countries can get together and say, hey, we will agree to these rules on digital trade, and anyone can sign them, but not everybody has to sign them. These are about WTO plus issues. The plurilateral on e-commerce should have come before the ministerial meetings this June, but they've been postponed by COVID. But this is the kind of approach that happens. These are things that a new member can decide to sign up to or not sign up to. Right? They're sort of the extra things. Right? So when we look at Uzbekistan's application, so moving forward to the present and the process of joining. This is the next to the last part of my paper, actually. So the process involves 4 steps. These are steps that are primarily intended to ensure compatibility between the applicant's policies and the responsibilities of a WTO member. So first of all, the government submits to a WTO working party a factual description of all the aspects of its trade and economic policies that have a bearing on WTO agreements. So that's the starting point. The working party then says, are these compatible with WTO rules? And if it seems that they reasonably are compatible, then you start bilateral talks between the new member, potential new member, and individual WTO member countries. Bilateral because some countries will have particular interest in some things. Some countries will be very concerned about Uzbekistan's treatment of cotton or Uzbekistan's treatment of imports of cars or so on. And they will negotiate to say for an agreement which will be generalized through the MFN clause. Once those agreements have been reached, the working party will draft a report, which will be the basis of accession. That will be presented to WTO members who will vote in the General Assembly or in ministerial meetings to accept the new member. So what's happening with Uzbekistan's application? The memorandum on the foreign trade regime has been prepared. The working party has been appointed. It's chaired by the Republic of Korea. This is open to all WTO members. And we're at the stage of getting questions being asked about the factual statement. These can be extensive. In the case of Tajikistan, there are 1,300 questions about the factual statement. It's just acting clarification on the basis of transparency. The bilateral talks will cover things like tariff rates or specific market access commitments, any other policies in goods and services. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, these are bilateral because different countries have different trading interests. But once they're agreed, whoever is negotiating with Uzbekistan on a particular issue, once that's agreed, it would apply to imports from all WTO members under the non-discrimination principle. And what we would expect is we're at the stage where Uzbekistan has put in its memorandum on the foreign trade regime. They've circulated the response to the questions from the working party members. And we're expecting now that the chair of the working party will hold consultations to say, are we ready to move forward from this and get the working party report? Do we agree on the factual summary? Do we agree that the bilateral negotiations have been completed? And then they'll begin on the working party report. Now, my understanding, I'm not part of the negotiations. Probably people in the audience maybe know these things better than I do. I mean, people seem to be optimistic that this is something which will happen probably next year. I mean, it very much reflects the fact that that Uzbekistan's economic reform process has accelerated since 2017. And so if that happens, there'll be a final package consisting of the working party reform, a draft membership treaty, a list of all the commitments made by Uzbekistan, and this will be voted on by the WTO General Council, the Ministerial Conference. If the members vote in favor, then the accession will go ahead. This slide didn't seem to work too well, so I'll bypass it quickly. This is a slide from the WTO website, which is very, very helpful, which is giving a guide to where Uzbekistan is in the process. Let me just mention a couple of things about this. I mean, I'm explaining the process as being one where Uzbekistan needs to accept WTO principles, but there are room for bargaining. If there are current policies that a WTO member objects to, usually these will be the bargaining point. It's a matter of degree rather than completely ending the practice. Also, there's possibility to bargain to establish exemptions to codes. For example, where you have sensitive subsectors or intellectual property features. You may want to insist that you have a right to import generic drugs, for example, rather than be bound by intellectual property rights. And that's why these negotiations, even at the fastest, will take 2 or 3 years. You know, and China took 15 years because many aspects of the Chinese economy in 1986, when they first applied, were incompatible with the principles of transparency. The Kyrgyz accession was fast because there's little that the WTO members object to that Kyrgyzstan insisted upon. I think with hindsight, Kyrgyzstan might have thought they should have insisted a little bit more about these things like intellectual property or some of the codes. In other cases, like Uzbekistan, like Azerbaijan or Belarus, Vanuatu in the Pacific, negotiations were halted because the applicant did not want to adapt national policies sufficiently. And that is always an option. Why you may want to go ahead and not take that option is that WTO membership signals acceptance of the world trade law, which most countries in the world have agreed to. It facilitates trade. It also constrains policy autonomy, for example, to reintroduce foreign exchange controls. But these restrictions, I think, are not things that a country particularly wants to do. So that's why, on balance, the benefits of membership seem to outweigh these costs of restriction on policy autonomy. So that's all that I really want to say. I mean, I'm trying to leave time for the comments from Zohid. I'll just finish up with a publicity. As Bahram mentioned, I've been writing books on Central Asia. The most recent is published in 2019, Central Asian Economies in the 21st Century. Very good book. We recommend you all to buy that. Otherwise, thank you for your attention. And if you would like a copy of the background paper or have any comments or questions, please email me at my email address. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, Richard, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. So before I give the floor to Zahid, if there are questions, I would like to ask our viewers to send them through Q&A. I will read those right after we finish with comments. So thank you. Zahid, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Zahid Askar from Westminster University. So I'm a discussant today. Thanks, Richard, for a very nice presentation and a very nice paper I've gone through. And it's very interesting and I think also beneficial to Uzbekistan. And it's timely written because Uzbekistan is again in the accession process to WTO. And I have formulated my comments as a sequence of questions, suggestions, and I'll go through very briefly. And the first one is about why not to enrich the paper with country situation analysis. The paper clearly discusses all these kind of requirements that Uzbekistan will be facing while accessing the organization. And of course, the working party at WTO will set a list of requirements on improvement of economic or financial or institutional level. So, but at the same time, I would say, okay, so these are good, this good information to the working group. But at the same time, it would be great if the paper is enriched by the situation analysis of the country. I mean, the economic situation at the economic condition in Uzbekistan at this stage, because many things, many changes have been happening, and it would give some clear understanding to what extent the country is prepared to join the organization. And also it would be very beneficial to the working group because they could get some fresh eye from outside, from you as an expert about the situation, current situation, economic situation, and also get some hints about identifying the main priorities. A second one is also related to the first one about situation as bad. Would be great to discuss about short-term and long-term consequences for the economy. And also it could be, for example, short-term, long-term across industries, across sectors of the economy, just identifying which industries are the most vulnerable. For example, how the car manufacturing sector will be affected in the short run. And if the country, for example, has some economic shocks in the short run, so then the executive government probably will be some reluctant in speeding up the process of accession to the organization. And so therefore, I think if you just include the increased awareness of the possible negative, positive effect would be very useful in decision making. Next one is that the accession process involves not only economic decision making, but also political decision making. So what may happen? So it may affect the speeds of the process of accession. So from both sides, from the working party at WTO, or especially from the working group decision making also can be affected. For example, what I mean, first of all, the country will be looking at neighboring country. For example, Kyrgyzstan has been a WTO member for the last 25 years. And also Tajikistan is a member too. So looking at the economic condition and the trade volumes, the country here so may conclude that the membership does not necessarily result in more trading. So that question about the relevance of the membership at this stage. Another thing, looking globally, of course, the country will be looking at the global experience. So the first one was like a neighboring, now global picture. For example, one WTO member like US imposes trade sanctions on another one like Russia or Venezuela and so on. Or if you look at the largest members of WTO, USA and China, they've been having trade wars, right? So these kind of issues again may raise a question about the relevance of the membership. So if the paper discusses this kind of economic decision process or political decision-making effects, so it would be more clear for the working group here, or it would be very beneficial to use this kind of information or results of data analysis. And the next one is about what the effect of regional arrangements or custom unions. I mean, for example, a group of CIS countries like Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan are members of the Eurasia Economic Union. So they have there some custom unions. It looks like a small WTO or like a GATT at its initial step, right? So whether this kind of membership may affect decision whether to speed up the process of accession to WTO, or it's better, for example, for Uzbekistan to join this kind of regional arrangement first and get some experience or adjust its economy or institutions, and then think about the accession to WTO. Because the government may think that why to get this kind of short-term strong economic shocks, and even short terms might be considered, we don't know if it's 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. In that case, of course, the economy will be affected. So, but you know, the policymakers usually like when it gives some immediate positive results. So therefore, these kind of things also may have effect on decision making of the country, and the inclusion in the paper, this kind of discussion would be beneficial for the working group that works on accession of the country to the WTO. So I won't be considering now the effect of COVID-19. Of course, it may delay because the WTO, the most thing that it doesn't like is allocation of subsidies, but COVID-19 making government allocating a substantial amount of subsidies. But I think the working party will be understanding this issue. Finally, my suggestion is I was thinking about the probably I can't say lag, but you did not include probably this situation analysis in the paper yet. While so many changes have been happening in this country, I think the issue here is that the sources of data or information probably mainly are in either Uzbek or Russian language and limited in English. And I don't think that you have some ability to speak, to understand Uzbek one. So therefore, probably this one is an obstacle. But I would suggest it would be, if you are happy, you could just collaborate with Westminster University in Tashkent on this issue and work in collaboration with the researchers that could collect data and information about all these changes. It can be whether in Uzbek, Russian, English, and include this situation analysis and to show to what extent this country is prepared to join WTO, and then what kind of consequences the economy will get from this. So this is my just suggestions. Anyway, thank you very much for the nice paper. Thanks, Bahram.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's lots of comments to digest, Richard. So perhaps I'll give you a few minutes to go over. Then there are questions, obviously, from the audience. I will read those one by one, but I'll just like to give you an opportunity first.
Yeah, thank you, Bahram, and thank you, Zoe, for those comments. They're very good comments. I haven't really got a situation analysis because I think there are people in Tashkent who know more precisely than I do, what the current state of the negotiations in. I think the crucial thing is what Uzbekistan puts in its the memorandum of its foreign exchange regime. How they're willing to negotiate on that, and what happens in the bilateral negotiations. In terms of the short-term versus long-term consequences, I think that depends very much on Uzbekistan's commitments. I think one of the problems for the region was that when Kyrgyzstan joined in, back in 1996, this was followed by difficult economic periods, and there tended to be a before and after analysis of that. It was really bad that Kyrgyzstan joined the WTO because their economy performed badly in the next few years. Even though we'd explain that by many other things, it had to do with the Russian crisis and Russian default, had to do with the price of gold and so on. I would not expect membership of the WTO to have a big immediate impact. I think what it really does is that it signals that Uzbekistan is open for business. And I think what's really important, I flashed up the publicity about my book, which the publishers put as a subtitle, Paving a New Silk Road. I think what is really important for Uzbekistan is that they want to take advantage of these new railway links we have between China and Europe, the better infrastructure in Central Asia to become more outward oriented. And does the government want Uzbekistan to be part of that? Do they want to be part of these global value chains that are now a feature of the global economy? If Uzbekistan is to be part of those, they have to be in the WTO, because that's the signal that that the trade regime, the border regime, is going to be one that is following international usage. I think the issue about the Eurasian Economic Union is one that's not necessarily needs to be put as in contrast. The current members of the Eurasian Economic Union, apart from Belarus, are all members of the WTO, and Belarus is in the process of acceding. So I don't think it's an either or. I don't think there's do you join the Eurasian Economic Union or do you join the WTO? I think you sign the WTO to illustrate or to give a signal of the the trade regime in Uzbekistan, then you might want to consider, on its own merits, does Uzbekistan want to join the Eurasian Economic Union or not? What are the costs and benefits? I don't think they're either or, though. I think they're things that could be done separately. I think the issue about the trade wars is relevant. The WTO has been under a bit of threat. I mean, I've mentioned that in the paper, the wars between China and the United States. Questions of how the dispute resolution mechanism is actually working under President Trump. I suspect this could change very quickly after November, but I don't think my paper was the place to actually speculate on the US election. But it is looking less likely that President Trump will be re-elected, and I would expect major changes then. But what we also see is that other countries, I mean, the European Union and Canada have made an agreement to make sure that there are dispute resolution mechanisms, even in the absence of a formal mechanism that has been destroyed by the United States. Australia, Japan are also involved in that. So I think the WTO is best if all countries are there, obviously best if the world's largest economy is there, but it's not going to just not work if the United States is there, because it's my belief that all the other members really want it to work. That's why they're there. So this is a challenge from President Trump, but I don't think it's an existential challenge. So maybe leave some questions from the floor and could come back to you at the end.
Okay. So I have a couple of questions from Raman's. So the first one is Raman Magilevsky, who you know well. So thank you, Richard. He writes, his question is, you briefly touched upon, so if it's feasible to plan for accession to both the WTO and the Eurasian Economic Union, which organization should be joined first? So is it the WTO first or Eurasian Economic Union? Second, from Roman Vakurchuk, is, could you give an overview of the main benefits that Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan have gained from the WTO membership, and what Uzbekistan can learn from their experience?
Do you want me to answer these?
Yes, please. And then we'll go.
Yeah. I think to Roman Mogilevsky, thanks very much for the question. I think you proceed, as I said in response to Zohid, I think these things can go together. They're not either or. I mean, if Uzbekistan does want to join the Eurasian Economic Union, I think that involves different issues. And when we talk about WTO, proceed with an application and join, and see how the process goes. It's not necessarily a horse race to see which one you join first. But I do think that there are separate issues. I mean, I think the WTO is to signal that you have this. You're abiding by normal rules on world trade. You're not going to be surprises when you get to the border and you're trying to bring a product into Uzbekistan, which is, I think, quite different from customs union, that is more the idea of the Eurasian Economic Union. And that would sort of also come in when I the answer to Roman Vakurchuk, that I think the benefits are that you send those signals, that you make it easier to trade. Right? And it's not that we can point to saying, hey, there's more trade in this particular product or that product. In general, it's easier to trade. For Kyrgyzstan, I think one of the things that happened as a benefit from its early membership was that Kyrgyzstan became the entrepot for Central Asia. Those huge markets that we had at Dordoy and in Osh and now in Akhbati. Those, to some extent, there are obviously other things involved. Those have happened because Kyrgyzstan was the country in the WTO. It was the easiest country to trade with in Central Asia. And so goods from China and elsewhere came into Kyrgyzstan and were then transshipped on to Uzbekistan, to Kazakhstan. And there was a value to being an entrepot. That was contributed to GDP. So I think we see those kind of things are beneficial. I think potentially there is a benefit of joining in global value chains, that there are enterprises in Uzbekistan, in Kazakhstan, that can be part of these global value chains. It's not been a priority, and it's been difficult in the past because the cost of international trade is so high. If you can get the cost of international trade down, then that becomes feasible. But these are not benefits you can say, oh, they joined WTO and the next year, there's a big increase in exports. That's not going to happen. It's not that kind of a decision that's being made.
Okay. And any lessons learned from neighboring countries, from their membership?
Well, I think that is a lesson that, although initially the Kyrgyz economy performed really badly after membership, I think in the long run it has been one of the strengths of the Kyrgyz economy that it is in the WTO, that it is seen as a place you can trade with, and that there are not unnecessary, unpredictable, arbitrary border controls coming in the same way you've had at some of the other countries in Central Asia.
Okay, so the next question is, so what industries and sectors are key for Uzbekistan in the WTO negotiations? So Zahid mentioned the car industry. There is also agriculture industry here. So Uzbekistan's priority on food self-sufficiency, how does it play with WTO rules? But also from me is, what would be the employment effects if you open up these sectors to global trade? So any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think in terms of the overall employment effects, this is a macroeconomic issue more than a trade issue. It depends, what happens to the exchange rate, to balance the international economic flows. So I don't see joining or not joining the WTO as helping specific sectors. Joining or not joining the Eurasian Economic Union, that might be a different matter in the sense that things like the car trade to Russia would be part of very specific negotiations. I think the main thing in the WTO, if we're looking at sectors, just to state first, I think the main thing is to say, being in the WTO, having good trade policies, you then allow market forces to determine what you're going to specialize in, not, and find out those niches. Specifically in agriculture, I think what's important in the WTO is what you reserve as being your ability to set regulations, not about access so much, but about some phytosanitary requirements, how you want to protect your agriculture for things like your quarantine requirements. Do you want to protect your farmers against competition from food produced under practices that are not allowed in Uzbekistan? So that kind of level of detail, I think that is important, to set these regulations that govern food trade based on considerations of food safety, health, the environment, and so on. I don't think it's sort of a matter of being able to say, hey, we want to protect our producers of potatoes or tomatoes or something like that. The only thing that would be a little bit specific, and it's much less important now than 30 years ago for the Uzbek economy, would be the WTO is a vehicle for trying to improve access to cotton markets. So in cotton, to join with countries like Brazil, the West African countries, to lobby for improvement in access to particularly the US and European cotton markets, so stop their protection and so on.
Okay. And another question is, which national regulations in Uzbekistan shall be adjusted first? First of all, to comply with WTO rules.
All of the ones that need to be adjusted to sort of get the final agreement. So this would be, so it could be across the board. I've already mentioned the agriculture ones, sanitary and phytosanitary restrictions. If there are any other technical barriers to trade that Uzbekistan thinks is important, it's important to make the negotiations. This is the time to establish that you want to make these exceptions. For trading services, if there's some things you want to make exemptions on cultural grounds or whatever, this is the time to make those. If you want to make some reservations about intellectual property rights, access to generic drugs rather than to drugs that have got patents on them, this is the time to make it. It's not really a matter of what order you do them in, because all your exemptions you want to claim or you want to make sure there have to be in the final agreement. And that happens all at once. So it's got to be done sometime before you make the final accession agreement. Because if you don't make it then, it's too late. I mean, I think a great example is that when the United States signed a general agreement on trading services, they didn't exempt online gambling. And when Antigua, this tiny island in the Caribbean, started exporting online gambling to the United States, the government got upset, but there's nothing they could do about it. It was too late. It said there was free access for services. So this is a time to decide what you want to make exemptions for. But it's not really a matter of ordering it. I mean, they all have to do it before you sign off on the final agreement.
Okay. And what may Uzbekistan lose from joining to WTO? And another question is, you've talked about transparency. So what is the role of institutions in Uzbekistan for joining WTO? So which institutions are the most important going forward joining the WTO?
I mean, what you lose by joining the WTO is you sign commitments that have the force of treaty force, that you're going to abide by these processes. So if a future government decides they want to reintroduce foreign exchange controls, they can't do that. Or if they do that, they will be in contravention of treaty. You get expelled from WTO. And WTO doesn't have any soldiers. But what you lose is this flexibility to adopt policies that are contrary to the WTO Charter. Now, my argument will be there's not much in there that you actually want to be contrary to. You want to be transparent, and you want your trade partners to be transparent, so that Uzbek exporters know what they're getting, know what the rules are if they want to export to Germany or to Canada or to Cambodia or wherever. Right? Those are that transparency in that sense, where things are written down, they're registered, you know what the rules are before you trade. Those are good things. So you're giving up the flexibility to just change things at the last minute to increase barriers. To me, that's something that you don't really want to give up. You want to have a government that is transparent, that people know what the rules are. What are the role of institutions? Well, that it comes down to the same thing. You want to be able to trust the fact that when the government says this is what we're doing, this is what they're doing. You need some belief in the legitimacy, but also the veracity of what the government says. And I think that it's that general principle. It's kind of more important to really than saying it depends on the courts or the Ministry of Trade or whatever. It's the general ability to trust that the government decisions, the decisions made in Tashkent, are the same thing that applies when you come to the border in Namagan or wherever.
Okay. One more question. So Uzbekistan is designing its subsequent industrial policy for the medium term. In view of the need for coordination among line ministries and private sector, what would you recommend how Uzbekistan should ensure its industrial policy is consistent with its ambition on the WTO accession?
Wow, that's a big question. It took you a minute to read it out, Macron.
Did you hear this, Begzat? So it's a question from Begzat.
I mean, it's important to be consistent. Again, it comes down, I think, to transparency and clarity. Make sure what the priorities are, not make it have too many gray areas that are open to discretionary treatment along the way, and you don't know what's going to happen. So clarity and transparency are really important. What the specific content of the industrial policy are, then it's fairly clear. You can't agree that you're going to have a maximum tariff of 10% on this particular product and then say, well, we're going to protect this industry with a 50% tariff. It's got to be consistent with the package that Uzbekistan is offering as its commitments to the WTO. You've got to be careful of what you're agreeing and the extent to which you can have subsidies for enterprises. Particularly state-owned enterprises has been a controversial area in the WTO. I don't think those commitments need to be very binding, because I say that what your commitments are mostly what you want to do anyway. There are 160 odd countries in the WTO. I mean, very varied countries that have made these similar kind of commitments. You know, it's not a narrow prescription. I think there was a bit of an image back in the 1990s in Central Asia that if you join the WTO, you're forced to have no tariffs. You know, that's just not true. You know, Tajikistan's tariffs average 10%. You know, they're in their agreement to join the WTO. You know, you decide, you know, what you want to write in there, what levels of protection you want. You know, you can't go back to 100% tariff on cars, but you can say we'll have some level of protection. And you know, the question to me makes a lot of sense. Yes, if you've got an industrial policy, you want to make sure that fits in. You don't want one minister negotiating at WTO and another part of the government deciding something completely different. Yeah. Cohesion is important.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So another easy one now. So your book. So you said, and I think we have a copy at the university. But what's one or two big message from your book, Richard?
I think the big message is Central Asia did fairly well during the first decade of this century when there was the resource boom, and obviously for the resource-rich countries, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, to a lesser extent Uzbekistan, or through labor remittances for other countries. That all ended in 2014, really. And it's important, I think, for the coming decade to promote diversification of the economy. And it's fortunate that's happening when there's been this loads of infrastructure investment happening, a lot associated with China, but associated with other countries, to be in a position to take advantage of this improved infrastructure. And that means you know, having an economy that's functioning well so that producers who have a good idea and a good product can take advantage of this ability to trade across the whole of Eurasia. I mean, it's a great window of opportunity that requires good policies. And for Uzbekistan and for Kazakhstan, you've got new governments, relatively new governments, that have an opportunity.
Okay. So you're very bullish about...
I am semi-bullish.
All right. So I think there are no more questions. So if Zohid, let me check in with Zohid if he has any comments, closing remarks before we give you the floor to close, Richard. Zohid, do you have any closing remarks or comments?
No, it's fine. It's fine. Thank you very much, Richard, for your comments, answers to my questions. And I'll be sending you my comments to your email address. And, so we can further discuss about my suggestions if you're interested in. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much, Zoid. I really appreciate your comments, and I appreciate the question from the audience, which I think you reflect. This is a fairly important topic, and my final remark would be just to be aware of where the WTO has come. It's not the same place as it was in 1995, which I think there's been a bit of confusion. You know, it is about setting a body of rules for international trade, and they're not bad rules. You know, we can all argue about details. They're not bad rules, and that's why so many countries have joined. It is a network effect. If you've got a set of rules, they're not useful if only you sign the rules. They're useful if everyone else does. And it's a big difference from 1995 that China and Russia are, as well as Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, are all in the WTO. Even Turkmenistan is moving to making an application now. So if all your neighbors are doing it, you want to play by the same rules. It really makes things easier. You don't want to be playing, ice hockey when they're playing soccer, or whatever the analogy should be.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Richard, for your time, for a very interesting talk. So to our viewers, thank you for joining. As you know, we do this every Wednesday afternoon, Tashkent time, brought to you by or jointly organized by Westminster International University in Tashkent, International Food Policy Research Institute, and Leibniz Institute of Agriculture Development in Transition Economies. So I would like to thank our speakers very much. One more time, our organizers, Kamjan Akram from IFPRI, Nader Janibek from IAMO for helping us organize this session, and our tech person, Ahtem, for helping us with all the background work. So thank you very much, Richard, Zohid, and our viewers. See you next time on Wednesday. And all of the slides and background paper and the video will be uploaded to our website at conference.wiut.uz. So with that, Thank you very much and stay safe. Bye for now.